The Galactic Council chamber smelled like burnt copper and old fear. That was the first thing Ambassador Vessel of Knowing, called Vess by the three species patient enough to attempt pronunciation, noticed when she entered the Great Hall of Concordance Station. The smell wasn't metaphorical. The Drenathes secreted a stress compound through their secondary skin layer, and right now, every Drenathi delegate in the room was leaking it freely. 12 of them stood clustered near the central projection table, their pale segmented bodies hunched inward, Calicere clicking softly in that anxious rhythm that translated, loosely, as, "We are about to die, and we have accepted this." Vess was Sulhari. Her species had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band across a wide, flat face, a respiratory system that functioned on methane-oxygen blend, and a deeply ingrained cultural philosophy that could be summarized, imperfectly, as clarity before panic. She breathed through her filter collar and crossed the chamber floor with careful steps. "What is the signal?" she asked. Counselor Dratham, eldest of the Drenathi present, his exoskeleton yellowed with age to something resembling ancient bone, turned slowly. His 4 manipulator limbs were folded inward, which among his kind indicated a grief response so profound it had moved past active emotion into something structural, permanent, as though the body itself had decided to stop pretending. "It is not a signal," he said. "It is a declaration." He tapped the projection table with one folded limb. The holographic display bloomed upward, filling the center of the chamber with pale blue light, and in that light, Vess saw the source grid, a 3-dimensional map of the local stellar cluster, roughly 47 inhabited systems rendered in soft gold. 16 of those gold points had gone dark. Not dimmed. Not reduced. Dark, as though something had reached through the display and pinched them out like candle flames. "The Vorkai," said Dratham. Vess stared at the dark points. She had been born 43 years after the last Vorkai incident. Every Sulhari child was taught about it in their second cycle of education, between lessons on agricultural chemistry and the history of the Concordance's founding. The lesson was always the same. The Vorkai came once. We do not know why they stopped. We do not know if they will return. We build our defenses, and we hope. 43 years of hope, apparently, had expired. "How many systems confirmed lost?" she asked. 16 confirmed. 7 more have gone to communication silence in the last 9 orbital cycles. Dratham paused, his Calicere still. "The pattern of movement suggests a trajectory." Vess looked at the map. She traced the dark points with her gaze, the spatial logic of them, the direction implied by their sequence. Her 4 eyes narrowed. The trajectory led to a small, dense system near the cluster's inner edge. A system that had only been admitted to Concordance observation status, not full membership, 11 years ago. A system that most council delegates privately considered irrelevant. "That system," she said slowly. "That is." "The humans," said Dratham. "Yes." A long silence filled the chamber. Someone's filter collar hissed. Outside the great transparent panels that lined the chamber walls, Concordance Station's orbital lights drifted slowly past like scattered seeds. Vess had met 3 humans in her career. She remembered all of them with a specificity she found difficult to explain, because each encounter had produced in her a feeling she didn't have clean vocabulary for, something between fascination and the particular discomfort of holding an object you cannot identify and cannot put down. The first had been a trade negotiator named Marcus. He had arrived 40 minutes late to a formal session, apologized with complete sincerity, and then proceeded to rewrite the entire proposed agreement in 2 hours using a method that the senior Drenathi economist on the panel later described as not wrong, exactly, but disturbing in its implications. The second had been a researcher named Dr. Yolanda Ferris, who had spent 3 years at a Sulhari institute studying deep space material degradation and who had, in her final report, included a philosophical appendix that made 2 of Vess's colleagues request psychological support consultations. The third had been a child. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, who had accompanied her parent to a diplomatic function and who had spent 40 minutes interrogating Vess about Sulhari structure with a focus and seriousness that Vess associated with senior academics. What she remembered most about all 3 was not their competence. It was the quality of their attention. The way they looked at problems, not from outside them, evaluating, but from inside them, inhabiting. As though every difficulty was a place they wanted to move into and redecorate. "We should warn them," said Vess. Dratham turned all four of his manipulators outward, the Drenathi gesture for expressing a truth so obvious it caused mild pain to speak. "We have transmitted 3 warnings. They have not responded." "No response at all?" "One response." He paused again, with the specific quality of a pause that contains something the speaker has not yet decided how to say. It was brief. He keyed the secondary display. A text transcription appeared, the human message, translated into standard concordant script. Vess read it. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Dratham, who was watching her with all 6 of his pale optical clusters. The message read, "We know. We're handling it. Please stay clear of our system until further notice. United Earth Command, Priority Channel 7. We're handling it," Vess repeated quietly. "Yes," said Dratham. "Against the Vorkai." "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. "Do they know," said Vess carefully, "what the Vorkai are?" Dratham's Caliceri clicked once, a sound that, in his language, meant something close to, "That is precisely the question that has been keeping me awake for 9 orbital cycles." "We do not know what they know," he said. "We know only what they said." Vess looked back at the dark points on the map. 16 systems. 7 going silent. A trajectory pointing at a small blue world that had been part of the Concordance's observation registry for 11 years and had spent most of that time being quietly underestimated by everyone who looked at it. She thought about Marcus, arriving late, rewriting everything. She thought about Dr. Ferris, writing philosophy into a material science report. She thought about a small girl asking questions about eyes with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. "We should prepare to receive refugees," said Dratham. "If Earth falls, the Vorkai trajectory continues into the core systems. We estimate." "No," said Vess. Dratham stopped. "No." His Caliceri spread slightly surprise. "We should prepare to watch," said Vess. Not with resignation. With attention. She looked at the map one more time. "Something is about to happen that I do not think any of us are prepared for. And I believe, I cannot justify it fully, but I believe that when it is over, we will need to have paid very close attention because what the humans do in the next few cycles will tell us something about the universe that we did not know before." Dratham regarded her for a long moment. "That is not a rational strategic position," he said. "No," Vess agreed. "But I have met humans. And every rational position I formed about them turned out to be incomplete." She turned and walked toward the chamber's secondary observation deck, where the long-range sensors were already tracking the darkness moving through space toward a small, unassuming world that had sent back a 3-sentence message to the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "We know. We're handling it. Please stay clear." The Vorkai had no name for themselves. This was one of the few confirmed facts the Concordance had gathered across 4 centuries of intermittent, catastrophic contact, not through successful communication, but through the painstaking analysis of debris fields, residual signal patterns, and the accounts of the 2 species that had survived Vorkai encounters long enough to record them before their civilizations collapsed anyway, from other causes. A generation later. The Vorkai did not name themselves because naming to them was a concept that belonged to the category of things that were separate, individual, distinct, and the Vorkai had no meaningful relationship with separateness. They were not a hive mind in the way that term was usually used. There was no central intelligence directing them, no queen, no hub. They were something more like a process, an ongoing, self-sustaining transformation of matter and energy that happened to take physical form. Concordance xenobiologists had spent considerable careers arguing over whether the Vorkai could even be classified as life. The most widely accepted position, reached after decades of debate, was that the question itself was a category error, that applying the biological framework of life to the Vorkai was like asking whether a river was tired. What they did was simple to describe and impossible to adequately convey. They moved through space, and where they moved, matter changed. Not destroyed exactly. Changed. reorganized at a level below molecular, below atomic, into configurations that bore no resemblance to what had been there before. Planets became something without a name. Stars flickered into new frequencies. The process was not violent in the way combat was violent. It was more like watching an enormous, patient hand reach down and rearrange a table setting according to rules nobody else knew. The species that had recorded them called it, in their respective languages, the revision, the unmaking, the correction. No one knew what the Vorkai were correcting toward. No one knew if there was an intention at all, in any sense that intention required a mind. The Concordance's most eminent philosopher, a Sulhari named Dathvel who had devoted 60 years to the question, had concluded in her final published work that intention might be the wrong frame entirely, that the Vorkai might be better understood as the universe's own process of reorganization made visible, and that the civilizations in their path were not targets, but simply in the way. That conclusion had not comforted anyone. On Concordance Station, in a small observation alcove off the secondary deck, Vess sat in front of a long-range sensor display and watched the darkness move. The Vorkai fleet, if fleet was the right word for something that had no ships in any structural sense, only formations of organized transformed matter that moved with coordinated but not commanded purpose, was currently processing the outer edge of the Taleni system. Taleni had been one of the 7 going silent systems. It was silent now. Completely. What the sensors showed in its place was a visual phenomenon for which Vess had no referent. It was not wreckage. It was not void. It was something organized, geometrically, almost beautifully organized, that had no relationship to the solar system that had been there 48 hours ago. It looked, in the long-range visual spectrum, a little like an enormous crystal formation. It looked nothing like a place where people had lived. She watched it for a long time, the way you watch something terrible not because you want to but because looking away feels like a different kind of failure. Behind her, the door to the alcove opened. She didn't turn. "You've been here for 6 hours," said a voice she recognized as belonging to Coordinator Pelsath, her administrative assistant, a young Sulhari whose primary professional quality was the ability to deliver difficult information without flinching. "The Council is requesting a position statement from the Sulhari delegation regarding the refugee." "Tell them I am composing it," said Vess. "You have been composing it for 6 hours. It is a complex statement." A pause. Then Pelsath crossed the alcove and stood beside her, looking at the display. He was young enough that he had no memory of the last time the Vorkai had appeared in concordant space, not even cultural memory, the kind that lived in the back of the mind as a vague ancestral dread. He had only the records, the education, the intellectual understanding. He looked at the crystal formation where Taleni had been, and she watched his face do the thing that faces did when the intellectual became visceral. "The humans haven't evacuated," he said quietly.
No.
"Their sensors must show the same data we're seeing. They know what's coming." "Yes." "Then why?" He stopped. "Reorganized. What are they doing?" Vess had been asking herself that question for 6 hours. She had assembled what she knew about human military history, which was considerable because she had been a student of unusual species for most of her career, and run it against what she knew about the Vorkai, and reached a conclusion that she found simultaneously impossible and, in some quiet part of her that she didn't fully trust, not entirely surprising. "They are not evacuating," she said, "because I do not believe they intend to retreat." Pelsath stared at her. "Against the Vorkai." "Yes." He stopped again. His 4 eyes moved across the display. "No species has ever." "No species that we know of," said Vess carefully, "has ever attempted a direct counter-engagement with the Vorkai. The historical record shows only evacuation, collapse, and the eventual cessation of Vorkai activity for reasons we do not understand." She paused. "The historical record does not include humanity." "That's not a meaningful distinction. The physics don't change because—" "The physics," said Vess, "are not what concerns me." Pelsath turned to look at her directly. "Then what concerns you?" She was quiet for a moment. On the display, the crystal formation that had been Taleni rotated slowly in the long-range light, geometrically perfect, utterly alien, beautiful in the way that things were sometimes beautiful when they were so far outside human or Silhari categories that the aesthetic response had nowhere else to go. What concerns me, she said finally, is that I have reviewed the human response to our warning 4 times. 3 sentences. No elaboration. No request for assistance. No expression of fear. She looked at Pelsath. And what strikes me, each time I read it, is not the confidence. Confidence could be ignorance. What strikes me is the word handling. We're handling it, Pelsath repeated.
Handling, said Vess.
Not fighting. Not defending. Not preparing to resist. Handling. As though the Vorkai are a situation to be managed. She paused. That is either the language of a species that does not understand what is coming, or a species that understands it differently than we do, said Pelsath slowly. Yes. They both looked at the display. The darkness between the crystal formation and the small blue world of Earth was growing smaller by the hour. What do we do? Asked Pelsath.
We watch, said Vess.
And we pay attention. And we try to be humble enough to accept that what we are about to see may require us to revise everything we thought we understood about the Vorkai, about resistance, and possibly about the universe. She exhaled through her filter collar. And we prepare the refugee protocols anyway because I am not certain, only attentive. Pelsath nodded slowly. He lingered a moment longer, looking at the display. Do you think they can do it? He asked. Not as a strategic question.
As something more personal than that.
Vess thought about Marcus, about Yolanda Ferris, about a small girl with serious eyes asking questions about vision. I think, she said carefully, that if any species in this cluster were going to do something that the rest of us would later be unable to explain using the frameworks we had before, it would be them. It was not an answer, but it was the most honest thing she had. The building where United Earth Command held its senior crisis sessions was not impressive from the outside. This was intentional. When the UEC had been established 19 years ago, during the period the history books were already calling the Concordance integration, the complicated, occasionally contentious, deeply strange decade during which humanity had gone from species that just discovered it was not alone to member adjacent of a 47-system political body. There had been extended debate about what kind of architecture should house its operations. The debate had resolved, characteristically, in the direction of pragmatism over symbolism. The building was a converted research campus in the mountains of Western Canada, all functional concrete and old glass, surrounded by pine trees that did not care about geopolitics. Inside, in the sublevel command center that had been built 3 years ago when the long-range sensor network first began picking up anomalies that someone, quietly, had started calling the Vorkai indicators, things were considerably more intense. General Amara Osei sat at the head of the operations table and looked at the faces around it. 14 people. The full Senior Crisis Council. They had been in continuous session for 11 hours, and the room had the specific quality of a space where people had stopped pretending to be calm and started simply being functional instead, which was, in Osei's experience, actually more useful. Run me the engagement framework one more time, she said. From the beginning. Dr. Thomas Reinhold, theoretical physicist, 48 years old, the person who had first proposed the framework 3 years ago when it had seemed like an interesting intellectual exercise, and only later had become the most important document in human history, tapped his tablet without looking at it. He had memorized the presentation. He had given versions of it 47 times. The Vorkai process operates through what we're calling coherence propagation, he said. It's not energy-based in the way conventional weapons are, and it's not matter-based in the way conventional defenses are. He paused, looking for the word that was least wrong. Informational. The Vorkai reorganize matter by changing the local rules that matter follows. They're not destroying things. They're rewriting the operating parameters of physical systems in a given space. Like corrupting a file, said someone across the table. Similar analogy, but don't take it too far, said Reinhold. Files are passive. Physical law is not, exactly, but the Vorkai found something. A layer beneath what we'd call the standard model. A kind of substrate. And they interface with it in a way that changes how matter and energy behave in a localized region.
He paused.
When they do this to a planet, the planet doesn't explode. It becomes something else. Something that follows different rules. Something that is no longer, in any recognizable sense, a planet. Which is why conventional weapons don't work, said General Osei.
Correct.
You can't shoot the new rules. You can't bomb a conceptual shift in physical law. He looked around the table. You can only counterpropagate, said Osei. Counterpropagate, Reinhold nodded. The framework proposes that if you can introduce a competing coherence, a different set of revised operating parameters, into the same substrate the Vorkai are working on, the two systems will interact. And the interaction will not be a standoff. It will be. He paused again. It will be a negotiation. A silence settled over the room. A negotiation, repeated Admiral Chinwei, the naval liaison, from the far end of the table, between competing revisions to the laws of physics. Yes. And our revision, said Chinwei carefully, is ours, said Reinhold simply. It's built from human understanding of the substrate, which is different from the Vorkai understanding because we came to it from a different direction. He paused. This is the part one want everyone to understand clearly. We are not proposing to fight the Vorkai. We are not proposing to outgun them or outmaneuver them. We are proposing to introduce a competing perspective into the same layer of reality they're operating on, and to let the substrate itself determine which revision is more coherent. And you believe ours will be, said Osei. Reinhold looked at her steadily. I believe ours is more complex, more internally varied. The Vorkai revision is consistent and thorough, but it is also, and this is the key insight, singular. It proposes one set of rules, consistently and completely. He set down his tablet. Ours proposes something messier, something more human. Another silence. Longer. What does that mean specifically? Asked Dr. Yolanda Ferris. Yes, the same Dr. Ferris who had written the philosophical appendix that disturbed Vess's colleagues. She was now the head of theoretical integration at UEC, and she was the second person in the room who had memorized Reinhold's presentation. In technical terms? It means, said Reinhold, that our countercoherence is not a single unified answer. It is a field of possibilities. Overlapping, sometimes contradictory but held together by, he stopped, looked at the ceiling briefly, by something I've been struggling to name for 3 years. Try, said Osei. He looked back at the table. By the experience of being uncertain and continuing anyway, he said. By the physics of things that don't resolve. By, and I understand this sounds non-scientific, but I cannot find better language, by the structure of caring about outcomes you cannot control. No one spoke for a moment. Then Admiral Chinwei said quietly, You build emotion into a physics framework. I built the consequence of emotion, said Reinhold. The way uncertainty changes how a system behaves. The way care, the functional, physical reality of caring, affects decision-making in complex systems. The Vorkai's substrate revision has no equivalent. It doesn't need one. It is certain, complete. It knows exactly what it wants physical law to be. He spread his hands. We don't. And I have believed for 3 years, that this is not a weakness. General Osei looked at the display. The Vorkai darkness was 4 days away from Earth's outer system. The countercoherence arrays, 12 years of construction, the single most expensive project in human history, hidden in the Kuiper Belt because the Concordance's observation satellites would have noticed them otherwise and asked questions nobody was ready to answer, were fully charged and aligned. All right, she said. We begin pre-deployment in 18 hours. I want all teams at final readiness in 24. She looked around the table. And I want to be clear about something. She waited until she had every eye. Whatever happens in the next 4 days, whatever we see, whatever it does to local space, whatever it looks like, we do not retreat. Not because retreat is impossible. Because if we retreat, every other world in this cluster becomes what Tauleni became. And I am not willing to accept that.
She paused.
Any questions? There were none. The people in this room had stopped having questions some hours ago. They had moved past questions into something quieter and more committed. Good, said Osei. Go get some sleep. 4 hours minimum. I need you thinking clearly. She stood. And someone tell the Concordance. Tell them respectfully, but tell them, to move their observation satellites back another 3 light hours. What is about to happen in this system is going to produce readings their instruments have never seen, and I don't want them to mistake the data for an attack. Dr. Ferris, gathering her materials, paused. Should we tell them anything else? About the framework? What we're attempting? Osei considered for a moment.
No, she said.
Let them watch. Let them try to understand it themselves afterward. A small pause. Some things land differently when you watch them than when you're told about them in advance. The first thing the concordant sensors registered was a change in the light. Not in visible spectrum, in all spectrums simultaneously. A shift in the data signature of the entire inner system, as though someone had adjusted a fundamental parameter of how the system produced and interacted with electromagnetic radiation. It was subtle enough that the automated filters initially flagged it as instrument error. Pelsath dismissed the error flags manually and looked at the raw data for 17 minutes before his hands started to shake.
Vess, he said.
She was already at his shoulder. She had not slept. She had been at the display for 22 hours, napping in the chair for 40-minute intervals, eating mechanically, watching. I see it, she said. What is it? I don't know. She reached past him and increased the sensor resolution. I don't have a category for it. This was a significant statement. Vess had been a xenological analyst for 31 years. She had a category for essentially everything the galaxy had shown her, even if the category was sometimes labeled unprecedented or under investigation. The fact that she was saying she had no category meant the data was doing something structurally new. The sensors showed the following, in sequence. The Vorkai formation had entered Earth's outer system on schedule, a dark, geometrically complex mass of transformed matter moving with its characteristic patient inexorability. The processing radius had begun to activate, the leading edge of coherence propagation extending outward, the first subtle revisions to local physical law beginning to propagate through the substrate. And then something else had activated. Something from inside the system. Something distributed across a broad arc of the outer orbital zone. The sensors placed the source points in what Earth catalogs call the Kuiper belt, and the signature was nothing that appeared in any concordance database. It is not a weapon discharge, said Pelsath. He was scrolling through comparison data with tightly controlled urgency. Not energy, not mass. Not any kind of kinetic or plasma or...
It is a field, said Vess.
She was watching the visual interpretation the sensors were generating, the computer's attempt to render something that had no visual equivalent in a form that biological eyes could process. What it showed was not accurate, she knew. It was an approximation, a metaphor in light. But what the metaphor showed was two things meeting. The Vorkai propagation moved like a tide, certain, complete, one thing becoming one other thing, the transition absolute. And the human field moved like... She struggled for the description. Like weather. Like a system that contained contradictions and held them in suspension. Like something that was multiple things at once without resolving into any single one. They are intersecting, said Pelsath slowly. The two fields. They are occupying the same spatial region, and they are interacting, said Vess. At the substrate level? Yes. That's not. Pelsath stopped. He had been about to say possible, but the word had caught in his throat because the sensors were showing him something that was clearly happening. The interaction was not a collision. It was not a cancellation. It was something the computer was representing with a visual metaphor that looked, to Vess's 4 eyes, unsettlingly like a conversation. Two different proposals for how matter should behave, meeting in the same layer of reality, neither immediately overriding the other. The Vorkai propagation is slowed, said Pelsath, his voice now very carefully level. By how much? He checked. Checked again. 63% in the last 4 minutes. Vess was quiet. On the display, the metaphorical conversation continued. Two systems, two different answers to the question of what physical law should look like, contesting in a layer of reality that the Concordance's most advanced instruments had detected only as background noise and never understood. And then, because she had been watching without looking away, because she had insisted on attention as a discipline, she saw the moment it changed. The Vorkai propagation did not stop. It did not reverse. It did something she had no word for. It changed texture. The certainty of it, that absolute, singular, complete certainty, became something less resolved. Something that had, for the first time in any recorded observation of the Vorkai, the quality of hesitation. Pelsath, she said quietly. I see it. Have we ever recorded the Vorkai hesitating? A long pause.
No, he said.
We have never recorded the Vorkai doing anything other than proceeding. They both watched. In the display's visual metaphor, the two fields continued their deep, invisible negotiation, and the Vorkai field, for the first time in 4 centuries of records, had encountered something it did not know how to simply overwrite. Because the human field was not offering a competing certainty. It was not saying, here are our rules, replace yours with ours. It was saying something structurally different. Something that, Vess thought, must feel profoundly strange to a process that had never encountered it before. It was saying, we don't know either. And we're still here. Dr. Yolanda Ferris was standing in the monitoring bay of Array Station 7, one of 12 stations embedded in the Kuiper Belt objects that formed the countercoherence deployment arc, and she was crying. Not from fear. Not from pain. From something that didn't have a clean name, the way important things often didn't. She was watching the data feeds from the substrate interaction, and she was crying because the data was showing her something that her equations had predicted, but that she had never, in 12 years of working on the framework, truly believed she would see. The substrate was responding, not to the Vorkai alone, not to the human countercoherence alone, to the interaction between them. As though the layer of reality they were both touching had its own, she would not use the word preference, she would use the word character. As though the substrate had a character, and that character was being revealed by the contest between 2 different proposals for what it should be. Ferris. The voice in her earpiece was Reinhold's, from the command sublevel. You're seeing what I'm seeing. Yes. The Vorkai field density is down to 41% of entry value. I know. The substrate resonance pattern is. A pause. Tomas, she said, and she used his first name, which she did rarely. The pattern looks like it's stabilizing, he said. Around our field parameters. Not entirely. Not completely. But orienting toward us, she said. A long silence on the channel. I didn't predict that, he said finally. I predicted contest. I predicted delay. I predicted, at best, a standoff that bought us time. His voice was careful, in the way that voices were careful when they were holding something enormous. I did not predict that the substrate would have a preference. Maybe it's not preference, said Ferris. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the data. Maybe it's response. Maybe the substrate has been waiting for something. For what? She thought for a moment. For a system that could tolerate its own incompleteness. She paused. The Vorkai offer the substrate a complete answer. Every time. For 4 centuries, every system they've encountered, they offer a complete answer. And the substrate accepts it because there's nothing else. Because no other system has ever offered it anything. And we're offering it. An incomplete answer, she said. That knows it's incomplete. That works anyway. She looked at the data one more time. Maybe that's what it needed. Maybe the universe doesn't want to be finished. Reinhold was quiet for a moment that felt long. That is either the most important thing anyone has said in human history, he said, or I am very tired and need to sleep. Both can be true, said Ferris. Both can be true, he agreed. Ferris, the Vorkai field is restructuring. Look at Sector 9. She shifted to Sector 9 on her display and looked, and what she saw made her breath catch. The Vorkai formation, that dark, organized, patient mass of transformed matter, was doing something. Not retreating. Not attacking. Something she did not have a word for, but that looked, in the sensor data's imperfect visual metaphor, like an organism encountering something it had not known existed and needing, for the first time, to think. It's never had to think before, she said quietly. No, said Reinhold. It's always known. On the display, deep in the invisible substrate where 2 proposals for reality were in conversation, something was being decided. Not by the humans, not by the Vorkai, but by the layer beneath both of them, the fundamental architecture of existence, which had apparently been waiting a very long time for someone to arrive at its door with a question instead of an answer. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was the largest convened in 2 centuries. Species that had not sent representatives to Concordant Station in decades had transmitted avatars. Species that had no physical presence in this sector had established real-time relay links at enormous expense. Every available display surface in the main chamber was filled with data feeds from the sensor arrays, and the room contained the specific quality of attention that only forms when a large number of very different kinds of minds are all watching the same thing, and none of them understand it. Vess stood at the central podium, which she had not been formally invited to occupy but had occupied anyway, because someone needed to, and the alternative was everyone speaking at once. "I will share what the sensors confirm," she said. Her voice was steady. "The Vorkai formation has been engaged in a substrate-level interaction with a human-deployed countercoherence field for approximately 19 of our hours. The formation's propagation activity has decreased by 78% from entry values. The substrate resonance patterns have shifted significantly toward parameters consistent with the human field architecture."
She paused.
"The Vorkai have not retreated. They have not been destroyed. They have stopped," said Counselor Drathom, from his position in the Drenathy section. His voice was different from how it had been when this began. The grief posture was still there, but something had moved inside it. Not hope, exactly. Something more careful than hope. "Not stopped," said Vess. "Changed. Their behavior is changing in real time in a way that has no precedent in any recorded observation." She looked at the chamber. "What I am about to say is my interpretation of the data, not confirmed fact. But I believe, based on what the sensors are showing, that the Vorkai are experiencing something for which their process has no existing response." "What are they experiencing?" asked a delegate Vess didn't recognize, one of the avatar transmissions from a species in the mid-cluster she had met only twice. Vess considered how to say it. "Uncertainty," she said finally. "I believe they are experiencing uncertainty for the first time." The chamber was quiet. "They have never encountered a system that could contest them at the substrate level," Vess continued. "Every civilization in their path has either fled or been revised. None have offered a competing vision of physical law. None have introduced something into the substrate that the substrate itself appears to find." She stopped, aware of how strange the next word was. "Interesting." "Interesting," repeated the unrecognized delegate. "The substrate resonance," said Vess, "is not simply stabilizing around human field parameters.
It is exploring them.
The data shows the substrate engaging with the complexity and internal contradiction of the human countercoherence field in a way that suggests, and I am aware of how far outside conventional xenology this is, that the substrate finds the incomplete answer more engaging than the complete one." A long silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the chamber, a voice. "What does that mean for the Vorkai?" "I don't know," said Vess. "I don't know if it means anything good for them or bad for them in any terms we can apply. They are process. They have been running the same process for 4 centuries because nothing has ever given them reason to run a different one."
She paused.
"The humans have given them reason. And I do not know what a process does when it encounters a reason to question itself." "You're describing them as..." Drathom stopped, Calicere moving. "You're describing them as capable of something like reflection." "I'm describing the data," said Vess carefully. "The data suggests that what is happening in the Earth system is not a battle. It is not a defense. It is," she stopped. "Found the word. It is an argument. And for the first time, the Vorkai are in an argument they cannot simply end by proceeding." Another silence, deeper than the previous ones. Then, very quietly from the Drenathy section, Drathom spoke again. "Ambassador Vess." His voice had changed entirely. The grief posture was still there in his body, but his voice was something else now, something older and more careful. "When you reviewed the human response to our warning, 3 sentences, you said there was something in the word handling that you could not dismiss." He paused. "Did you understand, even then, that they knew something we did not?" Vess looked at him across the chamber. "I suspected," she said, "that they were approaching the Vorkai as a problem with a solution, rather than a catastrophe to be survived. And I suspected that their solution would not look like anything we could have designed. She paused. I did not know what it would look like. I only knew that the species I had met, the ones I had sat with and spoken with and watched think, did not approach problems from the outside. They moved into them. She looked at the displays. And the only way to contest the Vorkai is to do exactly that. To move into the same layer of reality they occupy and offer it something different. She looked back at the chamber.
The humans moved in, she said.
And they brought with them the only thing they had to offer, which is the same thing they bring to everything.
Which is themselves.
Incomplete, uncertain, contradictory, still in process selves. She paused. And it appears, based on the data, that this is exactly what was needed. General Osei had not slept. She had tried, twice, in the chair behind her operations station, 40-minute intervals with her eyes closed, but sleep had not arrived, and after the second attempt, she had stopped trying and simply stayed in the chair and watched the data.
She was not a scientist.
She could not read the substrate resonance patterns the way Reinhold or Ferris could. What she could read was the operational data, deployment integrity, array station status, power flow through the countercoherence network. Everything was holding. Everything was, by every measurable parameter, performing as designed. This should have been reassuring. It was not entirely because the gap between performing as designed and actually working was still a gap, and it contained the possibility of the end of the world, and Osei was not the kind of person who stopped feeling the weight of things just because the instrument said the readings were acceptable. Around hour 30 of the engagement, Dr. Reinhold came and sat beside her. He brought 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking, and she accepted it without thanking him, and they sat together watching the data for a long time. Tell me something I can understand, she said finally. Reinhold considered. He was good at this, at translation, at finding the version of a technical reality that a non-specialist mind could hold without distortion. It was, Ferris had once told him, his most genuinely human quality. The substrate, he said, is, I keep coming back to this word, and I want to be clear that it is a metaphor, not a literal description. It is interested in what we're doing, in the architecture of our counterfield.
He paused.
The Vorkai have been writing in this layer of reality for 4 centuries. Always the same script, consistent, efficient, complete. And the substrate, the fundamental layer of physical law that underlies everything, has just been accepting it, because there was nothing else. And now there's us, said Osei. And now there's us, with a very different script, one that doesn't resolve cleanly. One that contains questions it doesn't answer and contradictions it doesn't resolve. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. And the substrate is reading it differently, processing it differently. The Vorkai script and our script are both present, and the substrate is not choosing one over the other. It's doing something more complicated. What? He was quiet for a moment. Integrating them, he said.
Partially.
The Vorkai revision is still there, but it has been altered. It has incorporated elements of our field, and ours has incorporated elements of theirs. He paused. What is emerging in the substrate of this system is something neither of us wrote. Osei looked at him. Is that safe? I don't know, he said honestly. The physics of the system have changed. Not catastrophically, not in any way that's immediately destructive to matter and life as we know them. But they've changed. Some of the fundamental parameters are different from what they were 40 hours ago.
He paused.
We won't know the full implications for years, possibly decades. But Earth is still here. Earth is still here. The Vorkai are not advancing. The Vorkai are not advancing. She nodded slowly. Then we're winning. Reinhold was quiet for a moment. I don't think winning is what's happening, he said carefully. I think something more complicated is happening. Something we don't have a framework for yet. He looked at the data. The Vorkai came here to revise the system according to their understanding of what physical law should be. And instead, they encountered a system that offered them a competing understanding. Incomplete, uncertain, fundamentally different in character. And in the meeting of those 2 understandings, in the substrate itself, something new has been written. He paused. I think we may have, he stopped. Started again. I think what we may have done is less like winning a fight and more like changing the conversation, said Osei. He looked at her. Yes, he said.
Exactly that.
They sat with that for a moment. Reinhold, she said. What happens to the Vorkai after this? He looked at the data, at the sensor readings from the formation that was no longer advancing, no longer processing, no longer running the process that had run unchanged for 4 centuries. I genuinely don't know, he said. A process that encounters a reason to question itself either adapts or stalls or, I don't know. We have no model for this.
He paused.
It's possible that what we've introduced into the substrate, the incomplete, uncertain, still-in-process version of physical law, is something the Vorkai process cannot simply continue through. Like, he searched for the analogy, like an equation that keeps returning new values every time you solve it. You can't finish it. You can only keep working. And a process that has always finished things, said Osei slowly, doesn't know what to do with something it can't finish. That's my best current understanding, yes. Osei looked at her coffee.
Drank some.
How long will it last? Whatever is happening in the formation. Unknown. What's your best estimate? A pause. I think, said Reinhold carefully, that the Vorkai may be at the beginning of something that takes them a very long time. Possibly longer than our civilization. Possibly longer than we can model. He paused. Because what they've encountered is not a barrier. It's not a wall. He stopped. A question, said Osei. Yes. He looked at her. They've never had a question before. They've only had answers. A long pause. Questions take time. Hour 47 of the engagement. The sensors showed the Vorkai formation had contracted by 30% of its original spatial volume. Not destroyed, contracted. Pulled inward. As though the process had, for the first time, encountered the concept of considering. On Concordant Station, Vess had stopped sleeping entirely. She sat in the observation alcove with a cold cup of tea and watched the long-range feeds with the focused, unwavering attention of someone who had committed to witnessing something historic and was going to maintain that commitment regardless of what her body wanted. Pelsath had started sitting beside her in silence, which she appreciated. He was good at useful silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. At hour 47, the feed showed something new. A signal. Not a field, not a propagation, a signal. Narrow band, tight, originating from the center of the contracted Vorkai formation and directed outward. Not in any known communication frequency. Not in any frequency the concordance had ever catalogued as communication at all. But the pattern of it, the internal structure, had the unmistakable quality of something being said.
Pelsath, said Vess.
I see it. Is anyone? The linguistics division is already on it.
He paused.
They've been on it for 4 minutes. They're saying he listened to something in his earpiece. They're saying the structural pattern doesn't match any known Vorkai output. Previous Vorkai signals have all been classified as process coordination, internal organization of the formation's activity. This is different. This is directional. It is aimed at someone. At Earth. Pelsath listened again. His expression shifted to something she couldn't immediately read. At the countercoherence arrays, he said. It is aimed at the countercoherence arrays. A long silence. It's talking to us, said Vess quietly. The Vorkai are talking to us. The linguists say they cannot decode it. The structure is alien to everything in the database. But the directionality is unmistakable. It is a communication attempt. He paused. The first Vorkai communication attempt in 4 centuries of recorded contact. Vess sat very still. The first in 4 centuries, during which the Vorkai had moved through 16 systems, transformed them completely, and never said a word to anyone. Never needed to. Their process required no conversation. It required only proceeding. And now they were not proceeding. They were contracting and generating a narrow-band directional signal aimed at the devices that had, for the first time, contested them.
They want to understand it, said Vess.
The counterfield? The incompleteness. She looked at the feed. They have encountered something that their process cannot resolve. And instead of stalling, instead of retreating, they are doing what a system with a mind does when it encounters a problem it cannot solve.
She paused.
They're asking. Pelsath stared at her. The Vorkai, he said slowly, are asking the humans to explain themselves. Or to explain the counterfield. Or to explain the nature of incompleteness. Or to explain how a system that doesn't have all the answers manages to function. She looked at him. We don't know exactly what they're asking. But they're asking. And that, she stopped. Her voice, very slightly, changed. That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen. In the UEC command sublevel, Dr. Ferris was doing something that was not in any protocol. She had been up for 41 hours. She had consumed more coffee than was reasonable. She had watched the Vorkai formation contract and the substrate settle and the signal emerge, and she had listened to the linguistics division's report. We cannot decode it. It matches nothing in the database. And then she had done something she would later describe to a journalist, incorrectly, as a hunch. What it actually was harder to explain. She had taken the raw signal data from the Vorkai communication attempt and fed it directly into the substrate resonance model. Not the communication database. The physics model. The one she had spent 12 years building. The one that described the layer of reality where the countercoherence field lived. The one that was her life's work in the most literal sense she knew. And the model had responded. Not with a translation. With a pattern. A resonance pattern that matched elements of the incoming signal and produced, in response, a counter pattern that was, in the mathematics of the substrate, a reply. She had not programmed this. She had not intended this. She had fed the data into the model because the model was the closest thing she had to a language for the layer of reality the Vorkai were operating in, and she had thought, in that irrational 41-hour awake way, maybe that's where the translation lives. And the model had answered. She stared at the response pattern for a long time. Then she called Reinhold. Tomas, she said. I need you to look at something. A pause. I'm looking at the substrate data. Look at my screen. I'm sharing it now. A longer pause. Yolanda, said Reinhold. His voice was very careful. Did you? The model generated it, she said. In response to the Vorkai signal. I didn't write it. You built the model. I built the model 12 years ago from first principles and theoretical physics, and she stopped. And everything else. Everything I knew. Everything I'd observed. Everything I'd thought about for 12 years. A pause. I built a model of how human understanding interfaces with the substrate, and the model just responded to a Vorkai communication attempt, in a language neither of us knew existed. Another very long pause. Are you telling me, said Reinhold slowly, that the physics model you built, which is, effectively, a mathematical representation of human uncertainty and incompleteness as they interact with fundamental physical law, just held a conversation with the Vorkai? I'm telling you it generated a response pattern that is structured as a reply to their signal, said Ferris. Whether that constitutes a conversation depends on whether the Vorkai can read it.
She paused.
And we won't know that until they respond, said Reinhold. They both waited. 23 minutes later, the Vorkai formation generated a second signal. Same narrow band. Same direction. Different internal structure. It was a response. To Ferris's response. Ferris fed it back into the model. The model replied. And something that had never happened in 4 centuries of catastrophic contact between the Vorkai and the civilizations of the local stellar cluster. Something that no record, no survivor account, no sensor reading had ever shown, began to happen. A conversation. Not in words. Not in concepts that had clean translations. In the mathematics of incompleteness. In the language of uncertainty meeting uncertainty. In the only medium that both systems, the process that had never questioned its answers and the species that had never stopped questioning its questions shared. The substrate. Ferris worked for 36 hours straight without stopping. Not because she couldn't stop. Because every time she thought about stopping, the model produced another response pattern, and she looked at it, and stopping became impossible. The exchange. She kept using that word instead of conversation, because conversation felt like a claim she wasn't ready to make, was not translatable in any direct sense. What she could describe, afterward, to the debrief committee, to Ose, to Reinhold who had stayed awake almost as long as she had, was the structure of it. The shapes that the substrate resonance patterns made. the way one pattern implied the next. The way the Vorkai responses changed over time, slowly, then more quickly, then in ways that the model had not anticipated and had to adapt to, producing something genuinely new with each iteration. What she described to the debrief committee 3 weeks later, when she had slept and eaten and was able to be precise. The first exchanges were, in structural terms, definitional. The Vorkai signal, she was calling it a signal now, not a process output, seemed to be engaging with the concept of the counterfield. Mapping it, testing its boundaries. The model's responses were, essentially, here is the boundary, here is what lies beyond it, here is the part that doesn't resolve. The Vorkai appeared to have no existing structure for the part that doesn't resolve. Their responses to this concept showed, and she used the word carefully, knowing how it sounded, something like confusion. A system encountering an input it has no processing pathway for, generating exploratory patterns rather than deterministic ones. Then something changed. Around hour 12 of the exchange, the Vorkai pattern shifted. The exploratory quality became something else. Something she could only describe as deliberate. As though the Vorkai process had found, within the alien structure of unresolved questions, something worth inhabiting. They started asking about specific things, she told the committee. Not the counterfield as a whole. Specific elements of it. Elements that correspond to, and I know how this sounds, emotional states. Emotional states, repeated the committee chair. The substrate resonance of the countercoherence field carries the mathematical signature of emotional states, said Ferris steadily. This is not metaphorical. This was the theoretical basis of the entire framework. Emotion, specifically the experience of caring about outcomes you cannot control, changes how complex systems behave at the substrate level. It leaves a physical trace. The counterfield was built from that trace. It is, in a meaningful sense, made of.
She stopped.
Made of what? Said the committee chair. Made of what it feels like to be uncertain and continue, she said. Made of what it feels like to not know if something will be okay, and to try anyway.
She paused.
The Vorkai were asking about that. Specifically. Structurally. As though they had found in the counterfield something that their 4 centuries of process had never produced and were examining it. And the model's responses? The model was built from my understanding of those things, said Ferris. From 12 years of thinking about how human psychology and human experience interface with fundamental physical law. When the Vorkai asked about those elements, the model responded with the most complete version of them I could embed in mathematics. She paused. I didn't translate emotion into physics. I found the physics that was already in the emotion. The committee was quiet. What, said the chair finally, did the Vorkai do with that? Ferris looked at her hands.
They stopped, she said.
For 6 hours, the exchange stopped completely. And then, and this is the part one need you to understand carefully, then they sent a pattern that the model classified as something it had never received. Not a question. Not a mapping of the counterfield. Something that the substrate resonance analysis categorized as, she stopped again. Found the word. Response. Not to a question. To an experience. They were responding to an experience. They were responding to the experience of uncertainty, said Ferris. Which they had apparently just had. For the first time. She paused. And what they sent back in the mathematics of the substrate was something that I've been trying to describe for 3 weeks in ways that don't sound completely outside the bounds of science, and the most accurate thing I can say is this. She looked at the committee. It was the Vorkai equivalent of a person saying, "Oh, I understand now."
Oh.
The Vorkai formation left the Earth system on day 7. Not the way it had come. It did not reverse its direction and disappear back along its trajectory. It dispersed, gradually, over the course of about 18 hours, the transformed matter formation dissolving into something the sensors read as ambient spatial energy, dissipating into the fabric of the system in a way that left no debris field, no residue, no structural trace. What it left was invisible. Or rather, invisible to everything except the substrate resonance sensors, which Reinhold had spent 9 years developing, and which showed something that he spent 6 months trying to describe in a paper before giving up and co-authoring it with Ferris, who had better language for it. What remained in the substrate of the Earth system, after the Vorkai departed, was a change. Not the change the Vorkai had been propagating, the unmaking, the revision toward their singular understanding of physical law. That process had been interrupted, contested, and ultimately abandoned. What remained was the thing that the substrate had written during the exchange. The thing that neither the Vorkai revision nor the human counterfield had authored individually. The emergent product of two very different systems engaging with each other in the deepest layer of physical reality. The paper they eventually published called it a coherence integration event. It was not a term that communicated well to non-specialists. What it meant, in practical terms, the physics of Earth's solar system were measurably, permanently altered. Not catastrophically. Matter still behaved as expected, life continued, orbits remained stable. But at the substrate level, at the layer below the standard model, the parameters had shifted. What the new parameters did, experimentally confirmed over the following decade, was this. Systems operating in the Earth system were more sensitive to emotional state. Not in a mystical sense, in a measurable, reproducible, physically grounded sense. Complex systems showed enhanced responsiveness to what Reinhold called intentional coherence, the state of a mind that cared deeply about an outcome and held that care in a functional, operational way. Computers worked slightly differently. Biological systems healed slightly faster. The effects were small, at first, barely measurable, easy to dismiss as noise. They grew slowly over years, and they extended outward from Earth at a rate consistent with substrate propagation. In 15 years, the effects would be measurable in the inner asteroid belt. In 30, at Mars. In 150 years, if the models were correct, the substrate change would have propagated through the entire local stellar cluster. And whatever the Vorkai were, wherever they had gone, they would carry within their process the change they had undergone in Earth system. The experience of uncertainty. The encounter with a question that had no final answer. The they had sent back in the language of the substrate. General Osei, reading the preliminary version of Reinhold and Ferris's paper in her office 18 months after the engagement, had a response to this that she kept private, mostly because she was a general and generals were not supposed to say things like what she thought. What she thought was, we didn't defeat them. We changed each other. And the universe changed around both of us. She thought this for a long time in her office, with the door closed. Then she wrote a note to Reinhold that said, I think you've described the most important thing that's ever happened. I also think Coherence Integration Event is a terrible name for it. Call me. The official concordance report on the Earth Vorkai engagement, submitted 14 months after the event, drafted by a committee of 47 specialists across 12 species, was 1,400 pages long, thoroughly sourced and carefully worded to avoid any claims that exceeded the available data. Ambassador Vess wrote a separate report. Personal. Unofficial. She submitted it to no committee. She sent copies to Dratham, to Pelsath, and through the Concordance's diplomatic channel to Earth, to Dr. Yolanda Ferris, because she felt Ferris had earned the right to read it. The report was 11 pages. It read, in part, we had, in the Concordance, developed a comprehensive understanding of the Vorkai. We knew their trajectory. We knew their method. We knew the outcome of every recorded encounter with them. We had transformed this knowledge into a posture, not of despair, exactly, but of managed inevitability. We understood the Vorkai as a force of nature, a process without a mind, a cosmic weather system that ended civilizations the way a tide ends a sandcastle, not maliciously, not intentionally, but completely. What we did not have the framework to understand was that a force of nature can be changed by what it encounters. We did not have this framework because, in 4 centuries of Vorkai activity, nothing the process encountered had offered it anything to engage with. Every civilization either fled or was revised. No one had offered the substrate, the layer of reality the Vorkai operate in, an alternative. The humans offered an alternative. I want to be clear about what that alternative was and was not. It was not a weapon. It was not a defense in the conventional sense. It was a competing vision of what physical reality could be, a vision built not from certainty, not from a complete answer, but from the accumulated physical trace of uncertainty sustained over time, of care directed toward outcomes that cannot be controlled. of minds that do not know if they will survive and build arrays in the Kuiper Belt anyway. This is the thing I have been struggling to articulate since I sat in the observation alcove and watched the sensor data show me two proposals for reality meeting in the substrate, and one of them hesitating for the first time. The humans did not win because they were stronger. They did not win because their physics was better or their technology was more advanced or their species was superior in any comparative sense. They changed the outcome because they brought into the substrate something that the substrate had never encountered: the lived physical reality of a mind that is uncertain and continues. A system that does not know its own ending and works as though the ending matters. The Vorkai, encountering this, experienced something they had never experienced. And in that experience, in that first profound encounter with not knowing, something changed in them that we do not yet understand, and may not understand for centuries. I am not a philosopher. I am a xenological analyst. What I can say precisely is this: the engagement in Earth's system changed the substrate of local physical reality in ways we are still measuring. It changed the Vorkai in ways we cannot yet trace. And it changed us, all of us, every species in the concordance, in a way that is harder to quantify, but no less real. We watched a species refuse to accept that certainty is strength. We watched them offer the universe their uncertainty and have the universe lean toward it. And we watched the most complete, consistent, singular process in our recorded history stop, contract, and, in the language of the substrate, say, "Oh, I have been a student of humanity for 30 years. I have met 3 of them personally. I have watched their history, their conflicts, their extraordinary and contradictory record of what they build and what they break. I have never been able to fit them into any standard xenological category. I understand now that this is not a gap in my analysis. It is the analysis. They cannot be categorized because they resist completion. They are not finished. They have never been finished. And in a universe that contains processes that want everything to be finished, to be resolved, revised, corrected toward a final form, a species that insists on remaining in process is not a curiosity. It is the answer the universe was waiting for someone to give. I do not know what comes next. I do not know if the Vorkai will return, changed, and what that change will mean. I do not know what the substrate shift in Earth's system will produce over the next century. I do not know if humanity will rise to what they have accidentally demonstrated about themselves, or if they will continue, as they always have, to be brilliant and terrible and uncertain in equal measure. But I think that is the point. The uncertainty is the point. Ambassador Vessel of Knowing, Silhari Diplomatic Corps. Personal report, submitted for record only. Concordance Station, month 14 post-engagement. 14 months after the engagement, on a clear night in Western Canada, General Amara Osei stood outside the building that housed United Earth Command and looked up at the sky. The stars were the same stars. The pine trees were the same pine trees. The air smelled like cold and wood smoke and the particular mineral sharpness of mountain altitude. Somewhere in the substrate beneath her feet, beneath the rock and the mantle and the core, in a layer that had no location exactly but was everywhere anyway, something was different. Something had been written that hadn't been there before. Something that would spread, slowly, outward from this small blue world into the cluster it was part of. She didn't know what it would do. Nobody did. That was, she had come to understand, entirely the point. She stood in the cold for a long time, looking up. Then she went inside. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was one of the things she loved about being human. You never ran out of work. You never ran out of questions. You never arrived. You just kept going. And,